In the breath between stars, before the rise of mankind and the long agony of empire, there was only silence, and in that silence, a presence, not born, not made, but forged across eons of unseen struggle, his will rippling through the Imperium like the shiver of a blade drawn in darkness. They say he walked beside humanity in the age before memory, a shepherd hidden in the dust of crumbling tribes and dying gods. They say he whispered to kings and burned witches with his gaze. They say he never slept. This is not the story of a man. This is not even the story of a god. This is the myth made flesh. The golden architect of 1,000 victories and 1,000,000 betrayals. A force vast enough to silence demons and yet human enough to mourn his sons. Terror calls him the master of mankind. The galaxy knows him as emperor, but none truly know him. Not anymore. His legend lives in vox records, crumbling scriptura, and the fractured memories of those who served, feared, or worshipped at his feet. And what little we can grasp, we clutch too, like relics, amid the storm. So lean closer. Silence the whine of the void shields and the prayers of your cogitator. Forget what you think you know. Because once, long before the Imperium was a name carved in fire, there was only him. And if this story, this journey into the shadows of a forgotten origin and a broken future, grips you as it should, then linger with us. Subscribe to the Chronicle, share the signal across your battle group, and ignite the beacon of engagement. For the galaxy is vast, but stories like this are our only stars. Before terror was terror, before its name echoed from the throats of 1,000,000,000,000 citizens, or was etched into the iron banners of the Imperium, it was Earth, not the Earth of cradle and comfort, but a wounded, convulsing sphere buried beneath its own sins. The age of strife had not yet torn open its belly, but the fractures were already there. Nation-states had collapsed. Language itself had become a weapon. Dust and data clogged the air in equal measure, and the old sciences, twisted by desperation, had begun to cannibalize their own children. And in that chaos, he moved not as a tyrant, not yet, nor as a savior wrapped in gold and armor. No, he moved as a man, just a man, skin and eyes, breath and thought. But there was something wrong with him, or rather, something that resisted the word wrong. He did not age. He did not sleep. He spoke every language with the fluency of a native, and none of them with belonging. He appeared in villages long lost to history, among tribes that warred for fire and protein. He stood in the courts of kings and the data vaults of collapsing technocracies. He never commanded, never declared himself ruler. Yet over and over, the world bent to his presence and forgot him when he left. They say he was born in Anatolia, a psychic fusion of every shaman's death scream coalesced during the dawn of man. Others say he is older still, that he is the last survivor of the old one's tampering, or a weapon discarded by God's long-gone feral. But none of that mattered to the world he walked in then. There were no legions or custodians or black ships, just a man who did not die. He killed, yes, but not for sport, for balance. The silence of his blade was the only prayer he knew. He assassinated kings who sought to build empires on broken backs. He drowned rogue psychers before their minds could erupt and call the warp into waking. He tore the hearts from chaos cults before they had names. And when the stars above began to flicker, when warp storms flared like cancer across the sky, he simply kept walking, as though he had always known they would. And what of his face? No one remembers. That is the truth. No pict remains. No data slate dares describe his features without contradiction. Some say this is intentional, that the Emperor's own psychic aura fragments memory itself. Others believe he appeared differently to each soul. A father, a stranger, a reflection. But one thing is always clear in every legend. Every half-burned tale passed down by rogue savants or secret libraries. When he looked at you, you felt known entirely, utterly. The kind of knowing that either heals or annihilates. He was never idle. While the rest of humanity stumbled across the wreckage of its own history, he built, quietly, precisely, in ancient bunkers beneath the Himalayan mountains. He crafted gene maps and war artifacts. He formed alliances with hidden tech guilds, traded blood for silence, and buried knowledge so deep it would take millennia to dig it free. And all the while, he watched. He watched as psychers began to appear in greater number. Watched as the first warp-born mutations tore through city-states. Watched as mankind began to hear whispers not their own. He did not stop it. Not then. This is the part the ecclesiarchy would burn for heresy. The truth they scrub from holy records. That the Emperor, their Emperor, allowed the flames to rise. That he let the darkness grow teeth. Because he was waiting, calculating, watching the shape of things to come, not in days or decades, but in thousands of years. He knew mankind would not be saved by sermons or science. It had to be and forging requires fire. They call him the master of mankind, but mastery is not mercy. In this first era, he did not gather armies. He did not preach unity. He built tools, weapons, not of steel, but of idea and genome. He began the work that would lead to the custodian guard, perfect flesh made to obey perfect will. And he waited for the world to scream loud enough for him to answer. But the scream had not yet come. What walked then was not a god, not a general, but the idea of control wrapped in bone. A mind so vast it had to wear a face. A patience that looked like kindness, but was only momentum. The Emperor was watching his species die in real time. And he smiled not because it was beautiful, but because it was necessary. The world did not yet know it was his, but it would. When the techno-barbarian warlords rose, he did not stop them. When the sky split with ion storms and radiation silos bled fire across the horizon, he did not flinch. Let the weak burn. Let the old orders collapse. It was necessary rot, fertilizer for what was to come. The Emperor understood something most men could not even name, that to unify mankind was not to save it, but to remake it strand by strand until only purpose remained, deep within the mountain crypts. Beneath strata untouched since before the dark age of technology, he grew silent armies of one. Not battalions, not yet, but solitary giants formed of flesh and lore. The first proto-custodians, not born, not cloned, sculpted, their minds blank slates, their hearts unreadable. Each one made by his own hand, each one a test of obedience, resilience, and silence. He did not speak to them as sons. He did not explain. He merely pointed, and they went. Above ground, terror wept. The once sprawling technopolises had imploded into warring districts. Language itself had splintered into dialects too numerous for even machine lexicons to decode. Cults formed around rusting satellites, mistaking their orbital drift for divine intention. And still, he waited. Sometimes he moved among them, wrapped in rags and psionic dampeners, studying how far his species could fall without forgetting how to crawl. In a scorched zone once called Pan-Pacifica, a tyrant had raised a cathedral from bone and ferrocrete, powered by the neural energy of enslaved science. The Emperor entered that domain in silence. No proclamation, no thunder. By dawn, the tyrant's throne was ash, and every data record that bore his name was missing. Only one word remained, carved into the wall in scorched binary: begin. It was the first moment the plan ignited. The warp was no longer a whisper. Now it howled. Untrained psychers across the planet screamed blood and levitated into orbit before bursting like overripe fruit. Demons clawed at the edges of unreality, feeding on fear. Earth's biosphere teetered. But amid the chaos, something new emerged: unity. Not global, not noble, but desperate. Clans and warbands began to align. They needed leaders, vision, iron, and in this vacuum, the Emperor stepped forward at last, not as a myth, but as a force. He did not call himself Emperor, yet he did not need to. When he spoke, people listened. Not because they agreed, but because his words silenced the war in their minds. When he pointed, cities knelt. When he commanded, flesh obeyed. He began to draw generals from the ashes, men and women who had resisted mutation, who retained logic amid the horror. And from their genetics, he harvested the seeds of what would come next. Not custodians now, but something larger, something more. Brutal, the Thunder Warriors. The world would remember them as titans of war. Giants in cracked armor wielding fusion axes and stormfire guns. But they were not gods. They were tools. Fast, loyal, terrifying, and terminal. Their gene seed was unstable by design. The Emperor did not want them to endure. He needed them to conquer, then die, and conquer they did. In less than a decade, the Thunder Warriors swept across Terra like a storm of extinction. Each victory was absolute. No treaties, no coalitions, only compliance. When they reached the Arctic Spire clans, they shattered glaciers beneath their boots. When the Panafric technoprists refused surrender, they were wiped from history, not just in body, but in record. The Emperor's hidden scribes erased them from every slate. Their gods, names, achievements, all unmade. And through it all, he never smiled, never bled, never stopped. He wore no crown. His armor was functional, austere. Not yet the ornate warplate of the Great Crusade. He walked through battlefields unguarded, not because he sought martyrdom, but because nothing could touch him. Bolts curved away, blades missed by inches. Even the warp, then still testing its grasp, recoiled from his will. To some, he seemed human. To others, inhuman. But to all, he was the center of gravity, the weight around which the broken shards of Earth finally began to orbit. Yet beneath that calm was something burning. He was running out of time. The warp was thickening, the psychic tide growing more volatile, and deeper still, in the vaults no human eye had seen. He had already begun the most secret work of all, the mapping of 20 perfect suns. Not of flesh alone, but of soul. Not tools, not warriors, legacies. But that is for later, for now. The unification wars had begun, and Terra would never be the same. The unification wars were not a campaign. They were a cleansing, a scouring of all that Earth now edging into its identity, as Terra had become in its 1,000-year decay. The Emperor, still unspoken by that name to many, did not lead with speeches or grand declarations. He simply advanced, one city at a time, one faction after another. His thunder warriors thundered across the continents, their very presence rendering resistance futile. They were crude by later standards, vicious and short-lived, but perfect for this stage of the plan. He knew their flaws. He had built them with expiration in their bones. Every culture that refused compliance was erased. Not just defeated, deleted. Memory was a weakness. The Emperor did not seek unity through tolerance, but through amnesia. The past had to vanish, or else the future would rot before it took root. So the Prote Administratum began its work in parallel to the conquests, redacting history faster than it could be remembered. And he oversaw it all, like a sculptor working a blade from a block of iron. Those few factions that submitted, peacefully, were allowed to persist under strict control. Their leaders, if deemed useful, were absorbed into the burgeoning imperial bureaucracy. Others were turned into servitors or harvested for genetic material. There was no pity, no reward for early compliance, only survival. The Emperor rarely spoke in public during this phase. He let victory speak. He let silence grow around his name like a myth waiting to be born. In the deeper regions of terror, especially in the underhives and data labyrinths, prayers began to emerge. Some called him the Storm's Eye. Others whispered of the hidden king. Still others, remembering ancient myths, dared to call him the last one. But he ignored it all. Titles were traps. What mattered was the work. And part of that work was ending the Thunder Warriors. The first signs came quietly. Reports of entire Thunder cohorts vanishing. Orders that led them into suicidal engagements without support. Internal conflicts, stoked by subtle manipulations, erupting into lethal fratricide. And finally, at Mount Ararat, the last stand, the Thunder Warriors had gathered, sensing their obsolescence. They knew, some even begged. They were broken things, forged for war but never meant to survive it. And the Emperor, cold, resolute, unleashed the first custodians upon them. Not out of vengeance, not out of fear, but because this was the next step. The Thunder Warriors were instruments of destruction. The custodians were instruments of eternity. The battle was brief, bloody, but not remembered. Official records call it a restructuring, a transition of force, but the ground itself remembers. The bones whisper in the wind over Ararat, telling of golden giants, slaying their crude ancestors, not with hatred, but with purpose. After that, there were no more Thunder Warriors, and terror was his. The planet was unified, not in peace, not in harmony, but in compliance. War had ended visibly, but below the surface, something far more vast was beginning. The Manufactura were reignited. The deepest vaults opened. The last of the surviving gene vaults, relics from the Dark Age, were brought under his control. And it was here, in these catacombs of forgotten science and fractured prophecy, that the real project began. The Primarchs, each one a fragment of him, but not copies, not reflections. They were possibilities made flesh, archetypes rendered in bone and will. The Emperor poured not just gene seed but intention into each one. Angron, Vulcan, Reboot, Magnus, all names still centuries from being spoken. But already they moved within their gestation chambers. Already the warp noticed. Some say the ruinous powers saw what he was doing and acted. That they tore the Primarchs from their pods, and scattered them across the galaxy. Others whisper it was his own flaw, that in binding so much of himself to these creations, he cracked open a door even he could not close. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. The pods were lost, flinging toward distant worlds, toward fate, toward betrayal. The Emperor did not rage. He did not collapse in despair. He simply adapted. It was time to expand, with Terra under control. And his finest warriors, now perfected in the Custodians, he began assembling the next force, the Legions Astartes. Space Marines, not as perfect as the Custodians, not as numerous as the armies of old, but balanced, loyal, powerful, and capable of burning entire civilizations to the ground in the name of unity. The stars awaited. But even then, in the silence between the end of Terra's conquest and the beginning of the Great Crusade, he stood, for a time, upon the broken remnants of Earth and did not speak. Some say he wept, others say he smiled, most say he simply stared into the sky, calculating what came next. The stars had once been home in the ancient days, before madness carved its name into the warp and human empires shattered like glass. Beneath unseen tides, mankind had ruled the void. The dark age of technology had built miracles. Warp drives that sang through reality. Artificial intelligences more complex than souls. Worlds shaped in days. Entire solar systems linked by golden arteries of communication and commerce. But that age had died screaming. Machines rebelled. Warp storms swallowed trade routes. Psychers were born in droves, untrained, unstable, screaming demons into life. The golden age became the long night, and by the time the Emperor stood upon Terra's poisoned soil, staring into the sky, those stars were cold strangers, but he would reclaim them. The Great Crusade did not begin as a declaration. It began as a movement, inexorable and silent. Fleets constructed beneath the surface of Mars and Luna, Astartes legions forming in hidden biotanks. The Mechanicum, that fractured cult of technology, brought into uneasy alliance through diplomacy laced with threat. The Emperor offered them something no Forge world could refuse: access to the STCs, the holy standard template constructs lost since the fall. Knowledge, not in full, never in full, but enough to make them kneel. And so they did. Mars declared allegiance. The Treaty of Olympus was signed in iron and fire. For the first time in millennia, the Red Planet and Terra were not rivals, but organs of the same emerging body. The Mechanicum would produce arms, ships, data, and machines. The Emperor would provide the crusade. The legions awoke. Each Astartes was a weapon, but not just of war, of ideology. Clad in ceramite and thunder, speaking in the language of conquest and compliance. Each bore within him the gene seed of a Primarch, even if those fathers were still scattered across the galaxy. The Emperor led them personally, his golden form at the head of the first fleets, cutting through the warp like a spear, and the stars, the broken, scattered colonies of humanity, saw him coming. Some submitted in awe, some resisted and were annihilated. Most hesitated, and were given a choice: compliance or extinction. There were no exceptions. But not all enemies were Xenos or rogue states. Some were ideas, faiths that had survived the long night, desperate, splintered religions clinging to the memory of divinity. The Emperor crushed them without mercy, not because he feared gods, but because he knew belief was a contagion, a threat to the new order. The imperial truth was declared, a doctrine of reason, science, and secular purpose. There were no gods, no demons, only ignorance waiting to be illuminated. The irony would become legend, but for now, the lie was golden. The lie that humanity could be united without cost. That logic could replace fear. That order could silence the warp. The Emperor knew better. But lies, when repeated with enough fire and discipline, become history. So he built a civilization on denial. The librarious programs were quietly deconstructed. Psychers were monitored but not named. The warp was mapped but not discussed. And the people scattered across worlds being brought into imperial compliance were told to trust the Emperor not because he was divine, but because he was right, because he had never failed, because he never would, even as the Astartes took worlds in his name, even as cultures were rewritten and species exterminated. He held the center of it all with terrifying precision. He remembered every name, every statistic, every deviation from plan. Those who met him in person described a mind that made them feel smaller than atoms. Not cruel, simply vast. Like standing at the edge of a singularity and knowing it saw you, judged you, and moved on. And then the sons began to return, one by one. The Primarchs were found, not by accident, but by design. The Emperor had always intended to retrieve them. The warp had merely delayed the plan. Now, with the storms receding and the light of the Astronomicon beginning to pulse across space, each recovered son was installed at the head of their genetic legion. Reboot Guilliman on Macragge, Pharos Manus on Medusa, Mortarion on the toxic world of Barbaroos. Each reunion was different. Some embraced him, some questioned him, some stared at him with eyes that did not blink, but all obeyed. For now, every reclaimed world added to the myth. And yet, that myth was never permitted to call itself divinity. Not yet. The Emperor forbade worship of himself with iron resolve. He ordered statues torn down, cults erased, even as the people who had never known peace fell to their knees in awe. The contradiction was profound. A god who denied godhood, a ruler who demanded reason while embodying the impossible. The legions grew. 17 of the 20 Primarchs had now returned, each one changed by the world that had raised him. Vulcan, the giant of Nocturne, bore fire and compassion. Perturabo of Olympia carried siegecraft and bitterness. Lorgar of Colchis, poet, prophet, and dangerous dreamer, was already a wound forming in the future. These were not children. They were archetypes brought to life, reflections of the Emperor's intention, or perhaps his fragmentation, and still he pressed outward. The stars became a map, then a net. System by system, the Imperium was born not through diplomacy, but submission. There was beauty in it, from a certain distance, fleets like glimmering daggers cutting through the void. Banners of the Aquila raised over alien skies, cities rebuilt with precision, law, and hierarchy. But behind the triumphs was a machinery of silence. Histories rewritten, cultures sterilized, entire languages unspoken after conquest. The Imperium was not a reunion. It was a reset. Even among the Astartes, unease began to whisper. Some legions chafed against the constraints. The word-bearers, under Lorgar, began erecting shrines, not just to the Emperor, but to something more, something unseen. When the Emperor discovered this, his fury was not theatrical. It was absolute. He brought them to heel at Monarchia, a planet they had transformed into a perfect world of devotion. He destroyed it. Every structure flattened. Every citizen displaced. He made Lorgar and his legion kneel in the ashes and declared, before the galaxy itself, that there were no gods, that the imperial truth would stand, or the entire crusade would collapse. Lorgar wept, the galaxy watched. The seed was sown in private. Some of the Primarchs began to question. Magnus the Red, master of sorcery and forbidden knowledge, walked paths the Emperor had sealed. Horus, the favored son, began to feel the pressure of trust that felt more like surveillance. Even Rogel Dawn, stoic lord of fortresses, wondered why the Emperor began to vanish from the front lines, retreating not to rest, but to build, because deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, something vast was being born. The Webway Project, the Emperor's greatest gamble, most secretive ambition, and potentially his greatest error. He sought to sever humanity's reliance on the warp, to build a new highway of reality, one that could connect the stars without exposing the soul to demonic corruption. A psychic infrastructure, ancient, alien, impossibly dangerous, and only he could manipulate it. The custodians guarded the catacombs where it formed. The Mechanicum maintained the machinery they barely understood, and the Emperor, once general, once father, now became architect, reclusive, distant. The galaxy noticed his silence to fill the void. He raised a single voice above all others, Horus Lupercal, his Warmaster. The Primarch of the Lunar Wolves was elevated to carry the Great Crusade in his stead. It was not favoritism, it was strategy. But Horus, brilliant and beloved, began to feel the weight of more than duty. He felt chosen. He felt seen. Others felt abandoned. The galaxy began to darken. Unknown to all but a few, the warp had not receded. It had learned. It had adapted. The ruinous entities who lurked beyond the veil of reality, Khorne, Desianch, Slaanesh, Nurgle, began to take form from the cracks in the imperial truth itself. Not through resistance, but through unacknowledged hunger. Through ambition, pain, love, fear, and pride. They did not assault. They seduced, whispered, and the Emperor did not speak, not of them, not of the risk, not of the gods he denied, but still fought. His silence, always a weapon, became a blindness. Even his sons were left ignorant of the warp's true face, because knowledge, he believed, was contamination. And so the most brilliant empire humanity had ever known surged forward, burning, conquering, building, all while the rot beneath the golden paint began to spread. There is a silence deeper than the void, the silence between trust and truth. That is where the Imperium now drifted, golden and blind. The Great Crusade raged on across the stars, a ballet of violence and vision, and Horus Lupercal stood at its center. A general beloved by his brothers, a commander who bled for victory. But beneath the laurels of glory, the fault lines widened. The Primarchs were not alike. They were not made to be. Some embraced their father's will with almost religious fervor, like Robert Guilliman, who constructed Ultramar into a model empire. Others obeyed out of respect, or fear, or pragmatic loyalty. But few understood the Emperor. Not truly. He was distant now, speaking less, showing himself rarely, hidden within the depths of the Imperial Palace where the Webway Project devoured all his focus. Even those closest to him began to wonder, what was the purpose? Why build a network beyond the warp when the warp was already their bloodstream? Why silence the librarius? Why banish knowledge? Why pretend that the warp was only storm and not sea? Magnus asked these questions in secret. Horus buried them beneath laughter. Lorgar let them fester into prophecy. And then it happened. Davin, a seemingly minor world, an operation of routine compliance. But it was there that Horus fell. Not to a blade, not to a traitor, but to a wound wrapped in whispers. The serpent blade pierced his side, but it was the corruption of the warp that bled into him. His brothers brought him to safety. His apothecaries could not save him. But the serpent temple priests could, and did. Within the Imperium, Horus saw a vision or a lie. A future where the Emperor abandoned mankind. A future where the Primarchs were discarded, sacrificed for a machine empire. A future where gods ruled in the shadows, and the Emperor denied their existence even as he warred against them. When Horus awoke, he was not the same. He smiled the same way. He gave the same orders, but the fire in his eyes had changed hue. And when he turned, the galaxy turned with him. Heresy was not declared. It unfolded, slowly, carefully. He whispered to Fulgrim, who danced too close to sensation. He challenged Angron, who already hated their father's chains. He courted Mortarion, who never trusted the warp, yet found himself strangled by it. Legion by legion, fracture by fracture, the truth unraveled. The golden lie had held for a time, but now it became a noose. Those Primarchs who still believed found themselves surrounded by brothers who spoke in riddles and moved in shadows. The Astartes, ever loyal, now divided, some without even knowing why. The warp itself began to pulse harder, sensing the blood about to spill. And the Emperor, he remained within the palace, working, building, believing that secrecy was protection. But silence is not armor. It is invitation. Magnus, desperate to warn his father of Horus's fall, tore open a path through the warp, a great psychic scream that shattered wards and triggered cataclysm. The golden throne sputtered. The webway fractured. And the Emperor, for the first time in decades, rose from his silence in fury. He did not thank Magnus. He condemned him. He did not seek Horus. He tightened his defenses. By the time the truth was spoken aloud, it was too late. The heresy had begun. And all of it, the war, the betrayal, the shattered families and sundered legions, grew from one central paradox. The Emperor, who had forged unity from truth, had built his empire on denial. He had demanded obedience while offering mystery. He had given his sons purpose, but never answers, and sons who do not understand their father will one day seek gods elsewhere. The lie was golden, brilliant, gleaming, but gold flakes when fire comes, and fire was coming. The galaxy did not fall in a single moment. It cracked like a great stained window, slowly, methodically, under pressure that had always been there. And when the shatter finally came, it wasn't the scream of heresy that echoed first, but silence. A terrible, knowing silence. As if the stars themselves had paused to listen. Istvan III was the beginning. On that world, beneath choking skies and loyal hearts, the first betrayal was etched in flame. Horus had gathered his brothers, Mortarion, Angron, and led their legions in what appeared to be another campaign of compliance. But once ground forces had landed, once their own Astartes had begun the mission, the order came: virus bombing.ext erminatus. No enemy forces, no resistance, just loyal sons, warriors who had bled beside their primarchs, Marines who still believed in the Imperium, in unity, in the vision of the Emperor, burned alive by their own kin. The life-eater virus swept across Istvan like a whispered death, and fire followed to finish the work. Cities melted, oceans evaporated. Silence returned, but not all had died. Some Astartes survived in the rubble, clawing their way out wounded and raging. And when the traitor legions descended to finish the purge, the first true battles of the Horus heresy began. Brother against brother, no negotiation, no parley, just fury. Betrayal is not a wound that bleeds, it burns, it screams. And Istvan was only the first scream. The Emperor felt it. Back on Terra, buried beneath the palace in the cold fire of the Golden Throne, he felt the war crack reality itself. His custodians, once distant, now sharpened their blades daily. The Mechanicum fractured as the heralds of Mars pledged themselves to Horus, and the Dark Mechanicum was born. Even the Astropaths, those blind seers who carried the Emperor's word across the stars, began to go mad from the screaming in the warp. And still, the Emperor did not rise. He could not. The webway breach Magnus had triggered had done more than damage the project. It had invited the warp into its halls. The Emperor had to stay, locked within the throne, holding the gate closed by will alone. If he let go, even for a moment, the demons waiting in the dark would pour into reality and claim Terra before a single fleet returned. So he sat, not idle, not broken, but burning. They say the Golden Throne is not a seat, it is a crucifix. And while he burned, his sons tore each other apart. The heresy spread like wildfire across Segmentum Solar. The word-bearers unleashed demonic rituals on Calth, poisoning space itself. The Alpha Legion turned compliance missions into death traps. The World Eaters, their sanity long since shattered, became berserkers of planetary extinction. And behind it all, Horus moved with terrifying elegance. Every assault was strategic, every betrayal personal. He was not just trying to win, he was trying to break his father's dream. And yet, not all hope was gone. Some legions held, some Primarchs stood tall, Falcon, Dawn, Guilliman Corax. They gathered what remained of loyal forces and began to push back, to hold critical worlds, to prepare Terra itself for the inevitable. Because they knew Horus would come. This war was not for territory, it was for the soul of mankind. And as ships darkened the void, as planets cracked and stars wept, one truth emerged from the shadows the Emperor had tried to ignore. There were gods in the warp. They had always been there, and now they had sons. By the time Horus reached Terra, the Imperium no longer resembled what it had once been. The vision of unity, order, and secular clarity had collapsed beneath demonic storms and brother wars. The Emperor's golden banners still flew, but their edges were frayed, soaked in the blood of trillions. Terra, once the cradle of mankind, was now its fortress tomb, ringed by defense platforms, orbital mines, the might of the Imperial fists, the custodians, and the remaining loyalist legions. And still, it was not enough. The siege of Terra was not a battle. It was a catastrophe slowed into slow-motion death. Horus arrived not as a lost son, but as a god. His fleet, swollen by corrupted legions, dark Mechanicum monstrosities, and demons newly birthed from the warp, blanketed the void. The skies bled. The stars dimmed. The moon cracked. And beneath it all, the throne world braced for its final breath. Rogel Dawn, last bulwark of reason, commanded the defenses. His every breath was a barricade, his every word a fortress. He turned the palace into a weapon. Layer upon layer of defenses, bastions, kills. But even he knew nothing could hold forever. The traitors landed in waves. Iron warriors tunneled through bedrock. Word-bearers chanted the names of entities no man should speak. Night lords sowed terror behind enemy lines, carving sigils into the walls of sacred halls. The Death Guard brought rot that even machine priests could not cleanse. And above them all, Horus waited, not in haste, but in hunger. He would not take terror by brute force alone. He wanted the Emperor to feel every failure, every death, every shattered hope before the end. The Eternity Gate was breached. Blood stained the halls of history. Custodians fell, one by one, their golden armor no match for the sheer volume of horror crashing upon them. The Imperial army, human, fragile, loyal, was reduced to ash. Even Astartes, demigods of war, found themselves overwhelmed by corrupted kin-wielding madness as easily as bolters. And yet they held, for hours, for days, for weeks, because to lose was to lose everything. Within the palace, beneath kilometers of armor and shrine, the Emperor remained seated upon the golden throne, holding back the tide within the webway, his body immobile, his mind locked in unending war against the impossible. To those who passed him, he seemed already dead, a withered husk held together by psychic fire and myth. But he was not dead, he was enduring. Then came the breaking point. The shield began to falter. The defenses collapsed inward. Word reached dawn, the time had come. Either the Emperor would act, or all would be lost. The loyalists had bled every drop. There was no one else left to stand, and so, at the edge of extinction, the Emperor rose. The myth stood. The flame moved. For the first time since the Crusades' early days, the master of mankind stepped into battle. He did not speak. He did not need to. He moved through halls stained in sorrow, flanked by Malcador the Sigillite, last of the Terran Psychers strong enough to breathe in the presence of divinity. Together, they reached the teleportation chamber. Together, they made the choice. Malcador would take the throne, holding the webway's breach for as long as his soul could last. A death sentence. The Emperor would face Horus, and so it began, the end of all things, upon the vengeful spirit. Horus's flagship now transformed into a floating nightmare of corrupted architecture and warp-bleeding wounds. The two titans met, not as father and son, not even as gods, but as weapons. The duel shattered time. Power beyond comprehension bled across dimensions. Each blow carried history. Each parry was a denial of destiny. Horus, swollen with dark favor, fought like a storm given shape. The Emperor, silent and blazing, fought like inevitability. And in that final moment, when the Emperor's blade could have ended it, swiftly, he hesitated. He saw what Horus had become. Not a warrior, not a rebel, but a puppet, a thing consumed by forces that had no name until he gave them one. And in that flicker of sorrow, Horus struck. The wound he delivered was no ordinary blow. It pierced not flesh, but soul. The Emperor fell, and the galaxy held its breath. There are wounds the body can heal, but there are others, deeper, slower, that bleed across the very fabric of history. When the Emperor fell aboard the vengeful spirit, it was not simply a blow to the Imperium. It was a crack in the soul of mankind. Time seemed to stretch. The stars grew quiet. Even the demons paused, as if uncertain what came next. But the Emperor was not dead. Not yet. What happened next is told in whispers and contradictions. Some say it was Dawn who reached him first, arriving in a flash of light and fury. Others speak of Sanguinius, the angelic primarch of the Blood Angels, who had already faced Horus, alone, and died at his brother's hand. Perhaps both. Perhaps none. Perhaps the truth is not for mortals to know, but what is remembered, what echoes in every cathedral and every cursed battlefield across the Imperium. Is this, the Emperor, rose one final time, broken, bleeding, dying, and with no more mercy left in him, whatever was left of Horus the Sun. The general, the favored, was gone. There was only the warp thing wearing his face. And so the Emperor struck not with a sword, not with fire, but with himself. He unmade Horus, not killed, but obliterated, burned his soul from existence with a thought sharpened into death. No demon claimed him. No echo remained. There is no Horus in the warp, only silence. Because the Emperor did not banish, he annihilated. But the cost was final. The Emperor collapsed. His body, what remained of it, was ash and armor. His spirit flickered like a dying star. Dawn found him, and what he heard, whether words, psychic message, or only grief, became the order that would define the next 10,000 years. Place me upon the throne. The golden throne, once the gateway to the webway, now became a prison. The Emperor's shattered form was bound to it by arcane science, ancient psychic mechanics, and the willing sacrifice of thousands. Every day, 10,000 souls are burned to keep him alive, not living, not dead, enduring a god. By necessity and the Imperium, it endured, to not in glory, but in flame. The dream of unity became dogma. The imperial truth was buried beneath the cult imperialis. Faith replaced reason. Denial became doctrine. And the Emperor, who had once forbidden worship, was now worshipped more fervently than any entity in the galaxy's long, mad history that the age of the Imperium began, and it was not kind. For 10,000 years, the galaxy has burned. Demons roam. Xenos hunger. Heretics rise. And the Emperor, trapped in silence, guides his empire not with command, but with presence. Astropaths hear his voice through pain. The Astronomicon shines with his will. The custodians still guard the palace, blades unbroken. And across 1,000,000 worlds, his name is carved into the bones of humanity. But he has not spoken, not truly. Some say he dreams, that in his silence, he builds again a plan within a plan, waiting for the hour when mankind is ready. Others say he is already dead, and only the machinery of the throne sustains a memory. Some whisper that his soul walks the warp, a phantom watching from beyond the veil, intervening when most needed. And then there are the prophets, the mad, the faithful, those who believe he will rise again, reborn not as man, not as ruler, but as God incarnate, the God Emperor, not of flesh, but of flame. But whether truth or madness, only one thing is certain. His myth endures, because it must, because if the Emperor falls, humanity falls with him, and so we remember him, not as he was, but as we need him to be, master of mankind, the Golden One, the light in the void, the last god of terror, eternal, silent, burning.